The following is a presentation from Creation Today Ministries and is made possible by the faithful support from our creation partners. To them, we say thank you. To learn how you can become a Creation Today partner, visit us at creationtoday.org.
I'm really excited about today's guest, Dr. Terry Mortenson. And I got to tell you, Dr. Mortenson will probably deflect everything I'm about to say and just say, I'm just deflecting that over to the glory of God. But you're about to be introduced to a man that when you're with him, he exudes the holiness and the humility of Christ. And I've enjoyed every opportunity I've had to spend with Dr. Terry Mortenson. His writing is incredibly robust in the way that he documents what he goes through. And I trust that you're going to learn a lot from Dr. T, as I like to call him for short, Dr. Terry Mortenson, tonight as we tackle this old earth versus young earth debate. So, Dr. T, how you doing, sir?
Very good.
Thank you.
We're enjoying a nice snowstorm up here in Kentucky.
Yeah, you're supposed to be at your office, and you said I'm snowed in.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny because when we were there filming the Genesis movie, we did all the interviews at the Creation Museum there where you work, and that was a time with a huge snowstorm. And like Dr. Purdom couldn't even get to the shoot. We had everything set up, and she's like, guys, I can't even get out of my driveway. I'm stuck. It was kind of funny. Well, thank you for joining us, and I hope you're staying warm and safe there at your house.
Yep, doing great.
So a little bit of background. Can you give our viewers a little bit of background about yourself? I mean, you studied the history of geology. You've gone through a lot of stuff. Can you give them a little bit of your background real quick?
Well, I grew up in a church-going family, but didn't come to know Christ until the end of my first year at the University of Minnesota. Through the witness of a Campus Crusade for Christ staff member. And I got very involved in that and then joined Campus Crusade staff and served with them for 26 years, most of that in Eastern Europe, both before and after the fall of communism, and then joined Answers in Genesis in 2001 as a full-time speaker. But during my time with Campus Crusade, I also had some study time, and I got my Master's of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and then went back to Europe and got my PhD in the history of geology. So it's been a very unexpected journey.
You have had a lot of twists and turns, but they have created in you a mind that is able to present truth that is, like I said, incredibly robust, and that's what I really appreciate about it. So thank you for using how God has taken you to help all of us. I asked you to help me tackle a topic that many people would look at as incredibly divisive in the church. Is the earth young or is it old? And a lot of churches won't even talk about this. They won't even bring this up. They won't even have the discussion. They say that causes division, and they stiff-arm the entire conversation. And I want to start because we've got some people on the webinar tonight that don't believe what I believe and probably what you believe in that. If you're on the webinar, just so you know, I do, and Dr. Mortenson does come from a young earth perspective. And when we say young, it's relative, okay? But a less than 10,000-year-old earth perspective. Doc, can you start by just kind of helping us, whatever perspective, whatever persuasion we are right now, helping us understand the bigger framework of why this should be a great conversation, a great topic that we should enjoy as a discussion?
Well, I think the first reason is because the Bible doesn't begin with, in the beginning, God had created the heavens and the earth, and there was a man named Adam, and he did a bad thing, and then there was a man named Noah, and he built a boat, and then there was a man named Abraham, and then we go on with the rest of the Old Testament. There's 11 chapters of information there that is historical narrative, and God wanted us to know those details, and we need to take them seriously. and not just dismiss them or say, well, my Bible starts with Genesis 12, verse 1 with Abraham. That's where I like to. No, we've got to start at verse 1 and work our way right through. So that's a very important, just biblical reason. And then when I turn to the New Testament, something that I've found a lot of Christians who are wrestling with this issue, they never ask, well, what did Jesus and the apostles do with Genesis? They actually referred to Genesis 1 to 11 more than any other 11 chapters in the Old Testament. And so when I look at how Jesus and the apostles dealt with those first 11 chapters, whenever they refer to them, they always treat them as if they are just straightforward historical accounts. They mean what they say, don't read mythology or symbolism into it. And so that is a clue to me of how I am to read the text. So those are some biblical reasons, but there's a huge theological reason that I have also found most Christians haven't thought about, including most theologians. And that is, if we accept the millions of years, they're not millions of years of empty time. It's not that God somehow doesn't like big numbers. It's what the evolutionists say happened in those millions of years. And it's millions of years of death and disease and animals ripping other creatures apart and asteroid impacts and massive volcanism that causes extinctions. It's a really bloody past. And so if we put all of that, those events and that kind of thing into Genesis 1, we've got a huge theological problem because, one, God is calling it all very good. And two, the Bible, and we can talk about this more, but the Bible makes it very clear that it was the fall of man in Genesis 3 that brought a judgment, a curse on the creation. God cursed the creation because of man's sin, and Jesus is going to redeem the whole creation in the future when he comes again. So that's a really big theological issue that we really need to wrestle with.
So if I was the person who was saying, listen, don't focus on Genesis, just focus on Jesus, you could almost reply, okay, because Jesus focused on Genesis.
Exactly. So when he was asked a question about marriage and divorce in Matthew 19, in Mark 10, he went back to Genesis. He talked about Abel being the first prophet and who was murdered. He talked about Noah and the flood, and he used the flood as a warning of his own coming judgment at the second coming. So Jesus continually referred to Genesis, and so did Peter and Paul.
I want to get to this at some point. I want to know what your thoughts are on people that go, well, science has proven the earth is old. So, okay, even if you can solve it from a biblical perspective with these examples that you're giving, and you say, okay, the Bible says the death of Abel, as he was the martyr, the first, and that was at the foundation of the world. I know it says that in Scripture, and you go through these, and they go, but Dr. Mortenson, science has proven that it's old. I mean, it's a done deal. It's already been settled, and you guys are actually making Christians look bad. You're making us look like we don't accept science. What would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I would say is we've got to be really careful with our words. Science doesn't say anything. It's scientists who say things. And not all scientists agree. Not all scientists are evolutionists. And if people say, well, anybody who doesn't believe in evolution or millions of years, they're not a real scientist. That's what we say is an ad hominem attack. It's attacking a person rather than dealing with the arguments. And the fact of the matter is, people may not like it, but there are many master's level and PhD creationists who got their degrees at respected secular universities And so when people attack a creationist and say, well, they're not a real scientist, they are indirectly attacking the universities that granted the degrees. And you're saying those universities are so incompetent, they couldn't tell that they had a young earth creationist in their program, and they foolishly gave him a degree when he wasn't a real scientist. That's ridiculous. Not all scientists agree. And the issue is not science because, as I hope we can get into a little bit, to reconstruct the past, you must make assumptions, and those assumptions don't come from laboratory experiments. They come from religious and philosophical frameworks or worldviews. And so nobody goes out and looks at a rock layer or fossil or a radioactive isotope with an empty mind. He's got certain philosophical and religious assumptions that affect what he sees and how he interprets what he sees.
Well, that sounds like a great place to launch from. I want to let you guys know that are watching, if you have a question and you want to throw it in the chat, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So throw it in there if you've got a question for Dr. Mortenson or you want to add to this conversation. But Dr. Mortenson, I think that's a great place to jump off. I'm going to let you kind of lead the way on that discussion, and let's go through that, because I think this will lend some understanding. Some people are going, I don't even know why there's a debate. I don't get this. But I think what you just hinted on there, that this is a worldview issue, is a great place to start. I'll let you just jump off right there.
Well, if we look at the history of this controversy, modern science was born in the womb of the Christian worldview, the biblical worldview. It's even secular historians of science will agree that although the Chinese and the Arabs, made some contributions with mathematics, and the Chinese, of course, inventing gunpowder and other things, modern science really developed in Europe. And it was because Europe was dominated by a biblical worldview, which gave some starting assumptions, which were, this world is not an accident. It was created by an intelligent creator, and he commanded us to study his creation. And because it was made by an intelligent creator, it's orderly, and we can study it, and it will behave in a consistent way because the creator is upholding it by his power. So that's an impetus then to study God's creation and to know that there's regularity. I mean, even in Genesis chapter 8, after the flood, God says, never again will I flood the earth, and there will be evening and morning, there'll be summer and winter and harvest. So that's telling us there's regularity. Then we go to, for example, in the book of Jeremiah, I think it's chapter 35, where God says that if the orderly movement of the sun, moon, and stars ever fails, then he will be unfaithful to Israel. He's basically saying, you can know that I will be faithful to Israel because of the orderly movement of the heavenly bodies. So modern science was born in the womb of the Christian or the biblical worldview. But after the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, there was a counter-spiritual attack, which we call the Enlightenment, but I would rather call the Endarkenment, because unbelieving people began to reject the scriptures and elevate human reason to the place of highest authority for determining truth. The rejection of the Bible. And so deistic and atheistic ideas began to flourish in Europe and say, we can explain the world without God, and we can explain the origin of the world without God. And so it was in the late 18th and early 19th century that new ideas for the history, origin and history of the world began to develop. Up until that time, Europe was dominated by Christianity. The dominant view, almost overwhelmingly dominant, was God created in 6 days about 6,000 years ago and destroyed the world with a global flood. But that came under attack in the late 18th and early 19th century.
I kind of tried to reference it in the email that I sent out ahead of time to say, listen, here's kind of the order of events. It was kind of 1795, James Hutton wrote Theory of the Earth, introduced old Earth ideas into the public sphere. And then Lyell really read that, geologist Charles Lyell read that and went, okay, I like this because this will help get science away from God's word and free us from what he thought were the shackles of God's word. And then Darwin came along reading Lyell's work. So those three men, Hutton, then Lyell, then Darwin, really set the stage for the entire evolution worldview that's being promoted today.
And what people need to understand is, people need to understand that there are really two broad categories of science. I like to call them operation science and origin science. We get confused on this whole issue if we don't recognize the significant difference between these kinds of science. And it uses the so-called scientific method, and I define it this way: the use of observable, repeatable experiments in a controlled environment, that's usually in a laboratory, to understand how things operate or function in the present physical universe in order to find cures for disease, produce new technology, put a man on the moon, etc. We sometimes call this experimental science or observational science. And most of biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, medical research, those are all forms of operation or experimental or observational science. So they're looking at how things operate. How do these cancer cells reproduce and multiply? How do these two metal alloys combine together to make a stronger steel I-beam? How can these chemicals make a stronger plastic, a lighter weight plastic? And that's how we've developed, putting a cell phone in everybody's pocket and the internet and all of that. And creation scientists all creationists love this kind of science, because we drive cars and we go to the doctor when we're sick, and we use our cell phones and our computers. But that kind of science won't answer the question, where did the Grand Canyon come from? How did those layers form? How did that hole in the ground form? And how long did it take? And when did it happen? That's a historical question. You can't recreate the Grand Canyon in the laboratory. Nobody was there to observe it. The observational experimental science can't answer the question, how did the first dog, the first squirrel, the first elephant come into existence? We can see how you can get a squirrel from a squirrel, how you can get a dog from a dog. That's observational science. That's repeatable science. But how did the first dog or the first squirrel come into existence? That's in the unrepeatable, unobservable past. And operation, experimental, observational science won't answer the question, how did Saturn come into existence? How did the rings form? When? How long did it take? Those are all historical questions. And so the question of creation and evolution is in the realm of history. And for that, we need origin science. And it uses what I call the legal historical method. And I define it this way: the use of reliable eyewitness testimony, if any is available, and observable evidence to determine the past, unobservable, unrepeatable events which produce the observable evidence we see in the present. So I see the Grand Canyon in the present. I see the rock layers, the erosional features. And the question is, what happened in the unobservable, unrepeatable past? I only have two ways to answer that question. I can look at the actual observable physical evidence in the present, and like a detective, try to look for clues that can unravel that past history. And then I can look for an eyewitness. Now, in the case of the Grand Canyon, we don't have any human eyewitnesses, but we do have an eyewitness in God. Now, he doesn't say anything about the Grand Canyon specifically in the Bible, but he does tell us about a global flood. He tells us about the creation of the world and the age of the creation. And those are relevant facts from an eyewitness that can help us interpret the evidence. So Origin science is also called historical science. And examples of that kind of science would be historical geology, paleontology, studying fossils, archaeology, studying old things from human civilization, cosmology or cosmogony, the origin of the universe, and criminal investigation. So when a police detective goes to the scene of a crime, he can't ask the dead guy what happened.
Yeah.
He can't raise him from the dead. He's got to look at the evidence. You know, is there a gun on the floor? Is the door been broken open? Is there a bottle of pills? Is there a suicide note? And if he's a good cop, he's going to go and talk to the neighbors. Why? He's looking for an eyewitness. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything that can help me correctly interpret the evidence? And there have been many people who have gone to prison just on the basis of circumstantial observational evidence, and later they were exonerated because an eyewitness came forward. And when they added the eyewitness testimony to the observational evidence, it all fit together correctly.
Wow.
So the question of evolution and creation, the question of the age of the earth, is in the realm of history. And when we think of those men that you talked about, James Hutton, Charles Lyell, and Charles Darwin, they were operating with some assumptions that did not come from any lab experiments. They didn't do laboratory experiments to come up with these assumptions. They came out of an anti-biblical worldview, just as a creationist has a biblical worldview.
Well, it is interesting as you contrast these two concepts, because most people in their mind, they're thinking, well, evolution is science and then creation is religion. And they that's the way they distinguish it in their mind. Evolution science, creation religion. Now, how do I bring these two together? And you're wanting me to bring two things that are opposing together in my mind. So that's kind of where they're pushing back on this.
Right. And so what we need to understand is that it is religion versus religion. It is worldview versus worldview. Both worldviews, the biblical worldview and the secular worldview, are being used to interpret the very same evidence. They're looking at the same Grand Canyon. They're looking at the same DNA. They're looking at the simplest living cell. And they're trying to figure out, how did that thing come into existence? Where did DNA come from? Is it from a pond 3.5 billion years ago, and lightning struck the pond and some chemicals came together and DNA formed? Or was there an alien being from outer space that seeded it here? Or is there a creator God? This is an issue that people are really confused about, because evolutionists like to talk about the results of Operation Science, cell phones, aspirin. In fact, I sometimes use an interview that Larry King had with Bill Nye, the science guy. And Bill Nye said, it's a really mystery, these creationists, that they use aspirin and they use cell phones, and yet they believe in creation and the flood. Well, that just shows me he either doesn't understand this significant difference between Operation Science and Origin Science, or he is deliberately confusing people. I have a quote right after this from one of the greatest evolutionists of the 20th century, Ernst Mayr, and he did recognize this difference. He said, evolution is a historical process that cannot be proven by the same arguments and methods by which purely physical or functional phenomena can be documented. So
wow,
they're not totally different, because in both cases you are observing things, but in Operation Science, we're observing things as they happen repeatedly, and we can manipulate those things. But in Origin Science, we're observing the results of something that happened in the past that cannot be repeated, and cannot be observed. And so that's a very significant difference. Does that make sense?
It really does. And I think it helps, like I said, it helps people go understand why this is such a big issue, because the scientific community has said, no, evolution is operational science. We are watching things evolve. We are watching things change. And so they're pushing that. But when you push them back and say, well, what are we actually watching change? You said it, we're watching dogs produce a variety of dog. We're watching cats produce a variety of cats. That is the operational science that we see. We are not seeing the molecule to man, if you will, evolution. We're not observing that. You can't see that in the fossil record. That has to be pushed on there. So I think they kind of do a little bait and switch when they throw that out there.
Exactly. And we do observe, for example, in the Grand Canyon, we do observe flash floods that are coming down a side canyon, and they're carrying a lot of sand and rock and boulders. We observe that, but we don't observe the Grand Canyon being carved. And in fact, the rapids, there are about 180 rapids in the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, and most of them were named. Most of the big ones were named by John Wesley Powell back in 1869, and the Colorado River hasn't removed any of those rapids. So, you've got side canyon erosion, but the Colorado River really isn't moving much down through that. It's just the small particles that can be suspended, but the big boulders that make the rapids, they're not going anywhere.
So it doesn't, if over, what's that, almost 150 years, we haven't got any new rapids, are all pretty much the same rapids, that does tell you something.
Yeah. So and assumptions are really important in origin science because we're dealing with the unobservable, unrepeatable past. They're kept in check in operation science because you're doing repeatable experiments. So if a Chinese scientist says that he's found a cure for cancer and he writes up the journal article of his research, if he did all his lab research right, a Lutheran scientist in Germany and a Muslim scientist in Saudi Arabia and a Mormon scientist in Utah, they could reduplicate the experiments. And if the first guy did it right, it doesn't matter what their worldview is, they'll get the same results. But in the question of origins and the question of history, what your starting assumptions are really important. And they will affect what you see and what you allow as an explanation for what you see.
This has been a presentation of Creation Today and has been made possible because of the generous support of our creation partners. To learn more about how you can partner with us, visit us at creationtoday.org/partner.